welcome everyone to this presentation that is sponsored by the Posthumanism Research Network, which is established here at Brock and is a partnered venture with Wilfrid Laurier and involves researchers in Canada, in Ontario, but also internationally. So we will be having a series of speakers, and today we are quite honored to host Dr. Cary Wolfe, who is the director of 3CT at Rice University, the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. He has authored many books, including the book, What is Posthumanism?, which makes inviting him all the more sensible, and other books such as Zoontologies, and contributed to The Death of the Animal, a dialogue, and whatnot. And he told me that he was going to tell you a little bit about his current work, what he is currently working on. I'm sure that we're going to hear a lot about it in the talk today. And the talk today is titled, There Is No World, Deconstruction and Theoretical Biology. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cary Wolfe.
All right. Okay, thanks, Christine. Nice to be here. Beautiful day. I came from Houston, Texas, where it's a little warmer than it is here, but last week was colder than it is here, so it's been that kind of winter everywhere. That kind of doesn't matter where you go, you just see what happens with the weather. So anyway, I'm glad to be here in support of this new research initiative that the two universities have gotten behind. I think it's a great idea, and I'm really eager to see where it goes. So what you're going to hear today is part of a book project that I've been working on for a while called Ecological Poetics, or Wallace Stevens' Birds, where I'm working up a reconceptualization of eco-poetics and, by extension, of possible eco-critical approaches to poetry. More specifically, I'm arguing that only a non-representational poetics can enable us to understand the most profound sense in which Stevens is an ecological poet, a sense that does not exclude but reaches well beyond the thematics and imagery of seasons, of climate, and so on, for which Stevens is famous, what he often called his poetic mundo. This shouldn't surprise anyone. The fact that this is non-representational should not surprise anyone, and indeed it might be seen as long overdue, because as we'll see in theoretical biology, no organism has a representational relationship to its environment. In fact, as I realized really only late in working on this project, I'm actually suggesting a kind of infrastructural poetics in the deep historical and etymological sense of poesis, a making, by which both Stevens' poetry and current work in theoretical biology on life may be understood. A robust naturalistic account whereby what Derrida and Heidegger and Uxkall before them called world may be understood not just in terms of its philosophical dimension, but also in terms of theoretical biology's account of how organisms relate through their autopoiesis to an environment that's always already more complex and multidimensional than can be representationally mapped by any single biological organism. Part of my motivation, part of my motivation is that deconstruction has been considered less relevant than other approaches to the kinds of questions we're discussing here. Vicky Kirby, for example, notes that, quote, there is no doubt that deconstruction is out of favor in critical theory circles, unquote, today. And she asks if deconstruction can reinvent itself as new, as creative, as different from its former manifestations, unquote. I think the answer is yes, not in spite of the fact, but because of the fact that in Derrida's work, as Kirby puts it, quote, a model or a representation is not a third term in between the biologist and biology or the writer and the world, but rather the one who knows the measuring apparatus and the object to be interpreted are strangely involved, unquote. What Kirby calls this reinvention of deconstruction is part of what I've been trying to do over the past 20 years, as some of you may know, I know Christine knows, by bringing deconstruction into conversation with work in both biological and social systems theory. Take, for example, this quotation from Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela that I used in my book, Animal Rights, from 2003, where they offer their own version of what Kirby calls strange involvement. The nervous system, they argue, does not operate according to either of the two extremes. It is neither representational nor solipsistic. It is not solipsistic because as part of the nervous system's organism, it participates in the interactions of the nervous system with its environment. These interactions continuously trigger in it the structural changes that modulate its dynamics of states. Nor is it representational, for in each interaction it is the nervous system's structural state that specifies what perturbations are possible and what changes trigger them, unquote. But this leads to a formidable snag, as they put it, because, quote, it seems that the only alternative to a view of the nervous system as operating with representations is to deny the surrounding reality. But all this indicates is the need, to use Nicholas Luhmann's language, to pay attention to not just first order but second order observations, to shift to the observation of observations, in other words. Thus, as observers, Maturana and Varela continue, we can see a unity in different domains depending on the distinctions that we make. Thus, on the one hand, we can consider a system in that domain where its components operate in the domain of its internal states and structural changes. On the other hand, we can consider a unity that also interacts with it. Neither of these two possible descriptions is a problem per se. Both are necessary to complete our understanding of a unity. It is the observer who correlates them from his outside perspective. The problem begins when we unknowingly go from one realm to the other and demand that the correspondences we establish between them, because we see these two realms simultaneously, be in fact part of the operation of the unity. Methodologically speaking, this leads to the conclusion, to use Maturana's language, that, quote, contrary to a common implicit or explicit belief, scientific explanations constitutively do not and cannot operate as phenomenic reductions or give rise to them. This non-reductionist relation between the phenomenon to be explained and the mechanism that generates it is operationally the case because the actual result of a process. And the operations in the process that give rise to it in a generative relation intrinsically take place in independent and non-intersecting phenomenal domains. The situation is the reverse of reductionism. This permits us to see, particularly in the domain of biology, that there are phenomena like language, mind, or consciousness that require an interplay of bodies as a generative structure, but do not take place in any of them. In this sense, science and the understanding of science leads us away from transcendental dualism. In a way, it should be emphasized from representationalism, whether of the idealist or realist side of the dualism, as Richard Rorty has so lucidly noted in his book, Objectivity, Relativism, and Truth. And I'll come back to that point later. So, all of the foregoing helps us to make sense of this remarkable passage in Derrida's discussion of Defoe's Robinson Crusoe in the second set of seminars on the Beast and the Sovereign, where he walks us through three possible theses, finished off with a meditation on the last thesis. And note that as we read this passage, we have to hear the immediate Heideggerian resonance of the term world that Derrida is invoking, a resonance that for Heidegger was informed deeply, of course, by the work of Jakob von Uexküll on human and animal Umwelten, or life worlds. So here's the quotation from Derrida. Thesis 1. Incontestably, animals and humans inhabit the same world, the same objective world, even if they do not have the same experience of the objectivity of the object. Thesis 2, incontestably, animals and humans do not inhabit the same world, for the human world will never be purely and simply identical to the world of animals. Thesis 3, in spite of this identity and this difference, neither animals of different species, nor humans of different cultures, nor any animal or human individual inhabit the same world as another. And the difference between one world and another will remain always unbridgeable because the community of the world is always constructed, simulated by a set of stabilizing apparatuses nowhere and never given in nature. Between my world and any other world, there is first the space and time of an infinite difference. an interruption that is incommensurable with all attempts to make a passage, a bridge, an isthmus, all attempts at communication, translation, trope, and transfer that the desire for a world will try to pose, impose, propose, stabilize. There is no world, there are only islands, unquote. Now, Derrida's assertion might seem counterintuitive. I think to most people it seems counterintuitive. But I hope it will seem less so in light of the biological theory that we've just glossed. There is no world precisely for the reasons that we may trace back to Uxkall and forward to Montaron and Varela, who demonstrate that what counts as a world is always a product of the contingent and selective practices deployed in the embodied inaction of a particular autopoietic living system. Now, it's worth noting at this juncture that Peter Sloterdijk, in Volume 3 of his Spheres project, offers up his own version of what we're discussing here when he writes, after quoting Lynn Margulis's work on cellular genesis, that, quote, the turn toward a pluralistic ontology was prefigured by modern biology and metabiology after they arrived, thanks to the introduction of the environment concept, at a new view of their subject. He continues with a quotation that is in fact from Uxkall. It is an error to think that the human world provided a shared stage for all life forms. Each life form has a special stage, no less real than the special state of humans. Through this insight, we gain an entirely new view of the universe. It consists not of a single soap bubble that we have blown up beyond our horizon into the infinite, but of countless millions of narrowly bounded soap bubbles that overlap and intersect everywhere. Sloterdijk continues, the collection of innumerable soap bubbles can thus no longer be envisaged as the monocosmos of metaphysics, where the abundance of existence was called together under a logos common to all. The philosophical super soap bubble, the universal monad of the one world, is replaced by a polycosmic agglomeration. Humans, for their part, after the end of the centric delirium, anthropo, ethno, ego, and logo, will perhaps develop slightly more appropriate notions of their existence in a milieu of ontological foams, unquote. And that is from Volume 3, Foams of the Spheres project. At this precise juncture, however, I want to emphasize what Derrida calls the machinalité of iterability and of all the forms of writing, script, and code subtended by it, not only because it is, as we'll see in a moment, perfectly compatible with a robust materialist and naturalistic account of how life evolves from non-living matter, how even the most self-reflexive forms of intentionality, awareness, and so on arise from the inorganic systematicity of repetition and recursivity, but also because this machinalité of what we might call the dead letter of code plus time helps us to gain some distance on Sloterdijk's more neo-vitalist tendencies, you might say, which have been in evidence, of course, since his famous or infamous essay that many of you probably have read called New Rules for the Human Zoo. I don't want to go into that conversation any longer, but we could. Now, the relationship between deconstruction and the life sciences has been taken up in the past, of course, in the critical literature by figures such as Anthony Wilden and more recently Christopher Johnson in his book System in Writing and the Philosophy of Jacques Derrida. Johnson provides a useful overview of the interdisciplinary matrix out of which the crosstalk between deconstruction and the life sciences emerged, including the Nobel Prize-winning work in France of theoretical biologists François Jacob, Jacques Monod, and André Wolfe on the role played by RNA in the transmission of genetic information, which in part opened the door for the reconceptualization of writing in terms of code and program that Derrida famously explored in Of Grammatology, whose first chapter, the end of the book and the beginning of writing, opens with a section called The Program. In fact, the first chapter of Jacob's influential book, The Logic of Life, from 1965, is also called The Program, where he argues that, quote, heredity is described today in terms of information, messages, and code. It's in this sense that of-grammatology announces that a primary writing therefore comprehends language, as Derrida puts it, in the same way that, quote, the contemporary biologist speaks of writing in program in relation to the most elementary processes of information within the living cell. And finally, Derrida continues, whether it has essential limits or not, the entire field covered by the cybernetic program will be the field of writing. Even before being determined as human, with all the distinctive characteristics that have always been attributed to man and the entire system of significations that they might imply, or non-human, the gramme or the grapheme would thus name the element, an element without simplicity. Now, as we know, this claim leads directly to Derrida's assertion years later that, quote, the elaboration of a new concept of the trace had to be extended to the entire field of the living, or rather, and this is important, to the life-death relation beyond the anthropological limits of spoken language. Or as he put it in the interview Eating Well, quote, these possibilities or necessities without which there would be no language are themselves not only human. And what I'm proposing should allow us to take into account scientific knowledge about the complexity of animal languages, genetic coding, and all forms of marking, unquote. But I would actually make an even stronger claim here. Namely, and this is a claim that Derrida himself, I think, was not in a position to make himself, partly because he hadn't read the material he would have needed to read to do this. He wasn't prepared to take deconstruction in this direction. But I would make an even stronger claim here, namely that Derrida gives us a theory of something like the relationship of the genetic or systemic formally code-bound and the epigenetic factors, the environmental or contextual setting in which the code is deployed, that we will see developed on the biological side by Conrad Waddington and Stuart Kauffman, among others, from the late 1950s onward. In the 60s, in other words, Derrida is formalizing and ramifying a theory of the relationship between the genetic and the epigenetic that's being pioneered at the same time, 1957 specifically, by Waddington, but which is only now being formalized after 50 years of hegemonic rule by Neo-Darwinian reductionism, with its overemphasis on the genetic level of code or script alone. And one of the ironies of the story, I think, is that deconstruction in its reception was initially sort of associated with the genetic side of the story, with the kind of dominance of script or code. So Waddington, who was a mentor to Kauffman, did pioneering work on the relationship between the genetic and the epigenetic and the effects of environment on the organism and its morphogenesis in his theory of the creode, or the developmental landscape. As biologist Dennis Noble explains in an article in the Journal of Experimental Biology, Waddington was able to demonstrate in a classic experiment, quote, the inheritance of a characteristic acquired in a population in response to an environmental stimulus, unquote, which August Weismann had attempted to do unsuccessfully in 1890, which was a failure that in turn laid the foundations for the Neo-Darwinian modern synthesis, which was counterposed to what is still to this very day, of course, called Lamarckism. Waddington realized that the developmental plasticity of organisms, in this case fruit flies, could be affected by environmental factors that interceded at different points along the developmental timeline. He used the term canalized for this type of environmental influence, and he quote, represented the developmental process as a series of decisions that could be represented as a series of valleys and forks in a developmental landscape, pictured here in this image. This is from the book from 1957. As Noble explains, talking about the experiment now, Waddington knew from his developmental studies that embryo fruit flies could be persuaded to show different thorax and wing structures simply by changing the environmental temperature or by a chemical stimulus. In his landscape diagram, this could be represented as a small manipulation in slope that would lead to one channel in the landscape being favored over another, so that the adult could show a different phenotype starting from the same genotype. The next step in his experiment was to select for and breed from the animals that displayed the new characteristic. Exposed to the same environmental stimulus, this gave rise to progeny with an even higher proportion of adults displaying the new characteristic. After a relatively small number of generations, he found that he could then breed from the animals and obtain robust inheritance of the new character even without applying the environmental stimulus. The characteristic had therefore become locked into the genetics of the animal. He called this process genetic assimilation. What he had succeeded in showing was that an acquired characteristic could first be inherited as what we would now call soft inheritance, and that it could then be assimilated into becoming standard hard genetic inheritance. Today, we call soft inheritance epigenetic inheritance. And of course, we know many more mechanisms by which the same genome can be controlled to produce different epigenetic effects, unquote. What we end up with then, let me get a little shot of coffee here. What we end up with then is thus the fundamental evolutionary and developmental unit being, as Gregory Bateson would put it 13 years after the publication of Waddington's book, The Strategy of the Genes, not organism as printout of a genetic code, nor even an organism as printout varied in its successive copies by random genetic mutations, still within the Neo-Darwinian paradigm, but rather what Bateson calls flexible organism in its environment, with flexible here denoting not just behavioral flexibility, but the very plasticity that Waddington had exploited in his experiment. All of this versus the Neo-Darwinian identification of the unit of survival, as Bateson put it, as the breeding individual or the family line. This reconceptualization is captured quite well in Waddington's own image of the developmental landscape as modified later by Noble, shown here, because it emphasizes an aspect that will become crucial to Kaufman's own work and others such as Margolis on complex systems and evolution, namely the functional networks, that is the real-time dynamic interactions that interact with environmental influences in specific ways to produce the developmental landscape, which can be varied by altering either the organism in question or the environmental factors that influence it. As we shall see in a moment, so this is Noble's reworking and recomplexifying of Waddington's original image. As we'll see in a moment, this is precisely where Stuart Kaufman's work on emergence, self-organization, and complexity picks up the story, and picks it up in a way that's consonant with Bateson's insistence that the redefinition of the fundamental unit of evolution has ethical, not just scientific, consequences. In the section of his 2015 book from Oxford University Press, Humanity in a Creative Universe, that I'm interested in, Kaufman assumes almost exclusively classical chemistry and physics. And, quote, the point is not to show that Newton's laws don't often work, they do, but to begin to demolish the hegemony of reductive materialism and its grip on our scientific minds, unquote. The central thrust of this section of the book, which forces us to rethink not just the evolution of the biosphere, but the entire concept of ecology, is that, quote, at least part of why the universe has become complex is due to an easy to understand but not well recognized anti-entropic process that does not vitiate the second law of thermodynamics. Briefly, he continues, and this is a quote from Kaufman's book, briefly, he continues, as more complex things and linked processes are created and can combine with one another in ever more new ways to make yet more complex amalgams of things and processes, the space of possible things and linked processes becomes vastly larger, and the universe has not had time to make all the possibilities. The universe will not make all possible complex molecules, organisms, organs, dust grains, mineral deposits, volcanoes, rivers, geologies, hydrogen, this is like a Latour litany, right? Stars or galaxies, automobiles or skyscrapers that are possible given the 10 to the 80th particles in the universe. There is an indefinitely expanding, ever more open space of possibilities, ever more sparsely sampled, which is the key point, as the complexity of things and linked processes increases. There is a deep sense in which the universe becomes complex in its exploration of these ever more sparsely sampled spaces of what is possible because it can, unquote. One of the more compelling examples that Kaufman gives of this principle obtains even at the level of organic chemistry before we even arrive at the domain of autopoietic organisms, or what he calls Kantian wholes, where we would be more likely to expect to find such forms of complexity. In a key passage in the book, and this is one of my favorite quotations of all time, I have to confess. In a key passage of the book, he writes, quote, "Proteins are linear strings of amino acids bound together by peptide bonds. There are 20 types of amino acids in evolved biology. A typical protein is perhaps 300 amino acids long, and some are several thousand amino acids long. Now," he continues, "how many possible proteins are there with 200 amino acids? Well, there are 20 choices for each of the 200 positions, so 20 to the 200th or 10 to the 260th possible proteins with the length of 200 amino acids. This is a tiny subset of the molecular species of chnops, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, with 100,000 atoms per molecule. Now, the universe is 13.7 billion years old and has about 10 to the 80th particles. The fastest time scale in the universe is the Planck time scale of 10 to the negative 43 seconds. If the universe were doing nothing but using all 10 to the 80th particles in parallel to make proteins the length of 200 amino acids, each in a single Planck moment, it would take 10 to the 39th repetitions of the history of the universe to make all the possible proteins the length of 200 amino acids just once. I told Stu, I said, I have not checked the math on this, so I'm just taking his word for it. But he swears that the math is correct, so he's a MacArthur Fellow. I'm good to go with that. So, as we consider proteins the length of 200 amino acids and all possible chnops molecules with 100,000 atoms or less per molecule, it is obvious that the universe will never make them all. History enters when the space of what is possible is vastly larger than what can actually happen. The next point is simple and clear. Consider all of the chnops molecules that can be made with 1, with 2, with 3, with 4, with N, with 100,000 atoms per molecule. Call the space of possible molecules with N atoms of chnops the phase space for chnops molecules of N atoms. That phase space increases enormously as N increases. Consequently, in the lifetime of the universe, as N increases, that phase space will be sampled ever more sparsely." Unquote. As Kaufman shows, this non-ergodic principle obtains even more radically and obviously at the level of the biosphere, whose, quote, "becoming cannot be prestated, is not governed by entailing laws, in which what becomes constitutes ever new actuals that are enabling constraints that do not cause but enable ever new, typically unprestatable, adjacent possible opportunities in which the evolving biosphere becomes," unquote. When we reach the level of what he calls Kantian wholes, or autopoietic organisms, the process is even more striking. If we think about the concept of biological function, for example, it's clear that while, quote, "in classical physics there are only happenings, the ball rolls down the hill, bumps a rock, veers, and so on, in biology we have to distinguish function from mere physical causation. Quote, "The function of the heart is to pump blood," he notes, "but the heart causally also makes heart sounds, jiggles water in the pericardial sac, and so on." Classical physics will not help us here because, quote, "the function of the part in its causal consequences that helps to sustain the whole," the function of the part, is its causal consequences that help to sustain the whole. Function is causal, in other words, but causal in a qualitatively different way from classical physics. As Kaufman notes, another nail in the coffin for the reductionist approach is the fact that, quote, "this capacity to define a function as a subset of causal consequences that can be improved in evolution further separates biology from physics, which cannot make the distinction among all causal consequences into a subset which are functions," unquote. As he baldly puts it, Dawkins wrote The Selfish Gene, 1976, as if DNA replicators were the heart of biology and the organism merely a vehicle for the self gene in evolution. I completely disagree. Organisms are autopoietic, self-creating wholes that achieve functional sufficiency, often improvable as the biosphere becomes. It is the functional closure and sufficiencies of organisms as Kantian wholes, not the genes they carry along, which is the heart of life and its evolution," unquote. Having established the importance of the concept of function, Kaufman hypothesizes, quote, "We cannot prestate the evolution of new functions in the biosphere, hence cannot prestate the ever-changing phase space of biological evolution. If we cannot know ahead of time what new functions will arise, we cannot write differential equations of motion for the evolving biosphere. We have no idea what new entities of processes may arise and become relevant to that evolution. Thus, we can have no entailing laws at all for biological evolution. Furthermore, as I will show, we cannot non-circularly prestate the niche of the organism in its world," unquote. Kaufman offers a nice compact example of this non-entailed and non-ergodic process in his discussion of what are called Darwinian pre-adaptations, or sometimes called exaptations, the emergence of new, possibly useful traits through random genetic mutation, staying with the Neo-Darwinian orthodoxy for a moment, in his discussion of the evolution of the swim bladder in fish, where a side effect generated by random genetic mutation can become a functional asset under different environmental conditions, as Darwin himself surmised. The Darwinian pre-adaptation, whereby some early versions of fish had lungs, enabling them to bounce from puddle to puddle, led in time to the biological function of a ratio of air and water in fish who now live wholly in water that allows neutral buoyancy in the water column. Did this change the future evolution of the biosphere, Kaufman asks? Quote, "Yes, and in two vastly different ways. First, new daughter species of fish with swim bladders and new proteins evolved. But second, once the swim bladder exists, it constitutes a new actual condition in the evolving biosphere. The swim bladder now constitutes a new, empty but adjacent possible niche or opportunity for evolution. For example, a species of worm or bacteria could evolve to live, say exclusively, in the swim bladder. The adjacent possible opportunities for evolution, given the new swim bladder, do not include all possibilities. For example, a T-Rex or a giraffe could not evolve to live in the swim bladder," unquote. One of the key theoretical points here, and it's one that I think articulates directly with deconstruction as I read it, arises when Kaufman asks, quote, "Do we think that selection in any way at all acted to achieve the swim bladder as constituting a new adjacent possible empty niche in which a worm or a bacterial species might evolve to live? No," he says. And what this means is that, quote, "evolution literally creates its own future adjacent possible opportunities for further evolution without selection in any way achieving this." Further, he adds, "Does the swim bladder, once it has come to exist, cause the worm or the bacterial species to evolve to live in it? No. The swim bladder enables but does not cause the bacterial or worm species to evolve to live in it. Instead, quantum random mutations to the DNA of the bacterium or worm yield variations that may be selected at the level of the whole organism by which the worm or the bacterial species evolves to live in the swim bladder," unquote. Now compare this with Christopher Johnson's characterization of code as it's theorized by Derrida's grammatology in the late 1960s. Quote, "The code, as Derrida understands it, is therefore constituted in process rather than in anticipation. Despite the suggestion of precedence implied in Derrida's articulation of the word program, the gram, the trace, the inscription are never absolutely primary. There is instead a kind of a precipitation towards sense that is ignorant of its future, so that the system is not pulled into the future by a mysterious first and last principle, but is pushed a tergo by what is handed down, selected, and recombined from its ancestral past. This philosophy is, in essence, a philosophy of evolution," unquote. To return to Kaufman then, he concludes by way of summary, quote, "The organism lives in its world. Causal consequences in classical physics pass from organism to world and back to the organism, and the functional closure or sufficiency of the organism in its world is what succeeds or fails at the level of that organism in its world. There is therefore no non-circular way to define the niche of the organism separately from the organism. But the niche is also the boundary condition on selection. The niche is only revealed after the fact by what succeeds in evolution. the mystery of what Darwin called the arrival of the fittest. It's hard to imagine a clearer articulation in more robust naturalistic terms of what Derrida calls, quote, the becoming space of time and the becoming time of space, the will have been of that which is to come, unprestatable and unanticipatable, with Kaufman's what succeeds in evolution and Darwinian exaptations being precisely the material substrate, the trace on which retentions of the past and protensions of the future are inscribed. Here, what Martin Hagelin calls the fundamental negativity of time is crucial, and it helps to underscore and indeed clarify an aspect of Kaufman's argument that's often only implicit or tacit. The negativity of time, quote, undermines both the idea of a discrete moment and the idea of an absolute continuity. Only if something is no longer, that is, only if there is negativity, can there be a difference between before and after. I'm quoting Hagelin now. This negativity must be at work in presence itself for there to be succession. If the moment is not negated and being succeeded by another moment, their relation is not one of temporal succession, but of spatial coexistence, unquote. It's precisely the combination of this negativity of time with the materiality of the trace as its site of inscription, figured on a larger biological canvas as the dynamic complexity of the system-environment relationship, that makes Kaufman's non-entailed, non-ergodic evolution of the biosphere thinkable. No negativity of time, no evolution, but also no materiality of inscription in the trace, no evolution. Indeed, we find here the site of a double inscription, not just on the material substrate of the living being, whether we think of Waddington's soft or hard inheritance or the exaptation of the swim bladder, but also in the dynamic contingency of the system-environment relationship in which that ontogenetic inscription happens, which can make the same inscription function differently at different points in time under different environmental circumstances. Okay, so let me move toward a conclusion now with what we might call a few kind of meta-theoretical questions raised by what we've covered so far. Last couple of pages. First, I think everything I've said makes a thoroughgoing deconstruction of the ontology versus epistemology divide not so much desirable as unavoidable. Epistemology is often understood these days as a branch of what Graham Harman and other object-oriented ontologists call correlationism, but this charge misunderstands a couple of quite fundamental postulates of the position that I've developed here and over the years. First of all, the question here is not epistemological, but actually pragmatic. As both Luhmann and Maturana make clear, the veracity of the systems theoretical analysis is not about epistemological adequation to some pre-given state of affairs, of ontological affairs, whether realist or idealist, but is rather based on its functional specificity in the contingent and dynamic unfolding of real time. Contrary to the understanding of autopoietic systems as solipsistic, the operational closure of systems and the self-reference based upon it arise as a practical and adaptive necessity precisely because systems are not closed. That is, precisely because they find themselves in an environment of overwhelmingly and exponentially greater complexity than is possible for any single system. What this means is that systems are characterized by a kind of finitude that can be formalized as a complexity differential. They maintain themselves and achieve their autopoiesis, in a sense, against all odds, in the very expanding universe of increasing and evolving complexity, non-ergodically, that Kaufman describes in his book. To put it another way, systems have to operate selectively and blindly, as Luhmann puts it, not because they're closed, but precisely because they aren't closed. And the asymmetrical distribution of complexity across the system environment threshold is in fact what forces the strategy of self-referential closure. To finish off this first point then, there's nothing to stop you on epistemological grounds from thinking that humors exist or that ethers exist. Indeed, the history of philosophy and of science makes that fact abundantly clear. But there's plenty to stop you on pragmatic grounds, even if, as Bruno Latour reminds us, bad ideas can work well enough under the right constraints for long periods of time. Or as Richard Rorty quite elegantly puts it, the pragmatist, quote, believes as strongly as any realist that there are objects which are causally independent of human beliefs and desires. She recognizes relations of justification holding between beliefs and desires, and relations of causation holding between those beliefs and desires and other items in the universe, but no relations of representation, unquote. There is no world, then, to recall Derrida's phrase, not in the sense of the world not being real, but in the sense of a philosophically realist account of the world not being real. And it's the utter confusion of these two claims, I think, the question of materialism and the question of realism, that's caused so much confusion in the contemporary theoretical landscape. As if disagreeing with the position called philosophical realism automatically means believing that the material world isn't real. Or as Raoni Padui explains in an exacting and careful essay in Angelaki that traces this problem through the history of philosophy since Kant, quote, one can maintain a materialist standpoint, namely that the entity and the real are ontologically prior to thought, while denying the direct and immediate access of thought to such an entity. In other words, one can be a materialist and an anti-realist at the same time, unquote. So, second meta-theoretical issue, part one. The question becomes then, what is philosophy's job if it's not to represent reality? Most philosophers, as we've just noted, seem to think it's to confirm a version of either realism or idealism. But no one dispatches this problem more elegantly and lucidly than Rorty himself in Objectivity, Relativism, and Truth, where he points out that philosophical idealism and philosophical realism, which seem like they're opposites, are in fact two sides of the same coin, and that coin is called philosophical representationalism. As he puts it, quote, for representationalists, making true and representing are reciprocal relations. The non-linguistic item which makes S true is the one represented by S. But anti-representationalists see both notions as equally unfortunate and dispensable. More precisely, it's no truer that atoms are what they are because we use atom as we do than that we use atom as we do because atoms are as they are. Both of these claims, the anti-representationalist says, are entirely empty. Both are pseudo-explanations, unquote. Of course, second meta-theoretical issue, part two, this affects how we think about truth claims in science. Here, let me briefly just recommend two additional essays, in particular from the book I've just been quoting from, Objectivity, Relativism, and Truth, namely Is Natural Science a Natural Kind, and the essay Non-Reductive Physicalism. In the first essay, working his way through a series of detailed and nuanced positions on this question, Rorty notes that the fundamental issue for scientific realism is the question, quote, what is the relation between facilitating prediction and control and being non-perspectival or mind-independent? In other words, why is facilitating prediction and control not good enough for the reductive realist as it is for Wittgenstein and Donald Davidson, who, quote, see the relation between language and the world as merely causal rather than also representational, unquote. The second essay takes a different angle of approach. Discussing Davidson's rejection of what he calls the dualism of schema and content, Rorty observes, quote, that this picture is the one which suggests that certain sentences in our language correspond to reality where others are true only, so to speak, by courtesy. Sentences about elementary particles are, among reductionist physicalists, the favorite candidates for the first status. Sentences about ethical or aesthetic value are their favorite candidates for the second status. Philosophers often suggest that the latter are not made true by the world, but made true by us, unquote. But on the Davidsonian view, we can replace this distinction by, quote, a distinction between sentences which serve a certain purpose and those which serve other purposes. And so, to adopt Davidson's view on the relation between reasons and causes, or more broadly, between the mental and the physical, is to grant the materialist everything he should want, to gratify all his legitimate needs, to permit him to pay all the compliments to the physical sciences that they deserve. but it will not permit him to gratify his metaphysical reductionist needs. It will not permit him to claim that he has finally grasped the essence of the world or of human beings, unquote. And finally, last point, meta-theoretical issue number 3, we need to remember that everything I've said today about Derrida in particular is complicated by other strands in his work. There's a deep divide among hardcore Derrida scholars about whether his work is best read in the systematizing terms that I'm offering here. I am not especially interested in those debates, but I am interested in an aspect of his work that the system resistors would emphasize, that we need to take seriously the question with which I kicked off this coda, namely, what is philosophy? And what are its differences from scientific discourse? A question that's only pressed upon us all the more by the poor quality of philosophizing that we find in people like Stuart Kaufmann and Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela and others of similar ilk, which is just another way of saying they're not trained in philosophy. They've been doing something else all their lives. So the site where this most comes to a head in Derrida's work is, of course, his writings on Heidegger, and specifically on Heidegger's dogma, as he puts it, regarding the differences between humans and animals. I think we should take seriously Derrida's assertion that we need to heed Heidegger's ultra-philosophical suggestion that part of what defines the specificity of philosophical versus scientific statements is the understanding that Dasein is not existentially a living empirical being, that the being of beings is not a being, as he puts it. Now, I've discussed this in some detail in my last book, Before the Law, in relation to cephalopods, actually, in non-human Dasein, but part of what's at stake here for Derrida is the danger of indexing philosophical questions to biological and, more pointedly, to put it in biopolitical terms, racial taxonomies. This, quote, constant gesture of Heidegger's, Derrida writes, whose political implications are to be taken seriously, unquote, is not just political and pragmatic. It is also, quote, from the very beginning, a case of nothing less than determining philosophy on its own basis, unquote. For Heidegger, in other words, science cannot ask the kinds of questions that philosophy asks. Questions, for example, about the phenomenological domain, which may be the product of a concatenation of material forces, but cannot be reduced to them. After all, that's what emergence and self-organization and so on are in theoretical biology. And this brings us back to the question of world with which we opened, and to Heidegger's famous assertion that the stone has no world, while the animal is poor in world and man is world building. And here, Derrida makes a fascinating assertion in his engagement of Heidegger when he writes in The Animal That Therefore I Am that, quote, these theses of Heidegger's are theses on world. They are not theses on the stone, on the animal, or on man, but they are theses on world. And the moments that I find most interesting and at the same time most discreet along this path are the moments when Heidegger more or less says, we don't finally know what world is. At bottom, it is a very obscure concept, unquote. I think this assertion that what drives Heidegger's ultra-philosophical project is that we don't know what world is opens up a space to redescribe the origins of this problem, if we want to put it that way, and of course we don't, in terms of what Kaufmann calls the non-ergodic, non-entailed, and creative evolution of the biosphere and of life. And so while it's true that the kinds of scientific statements that Heidegger is objecting to are not the kinds of scientific statements that Kaufmann and Maturana and Varela are making, they do not cleave neatly, for example, along the lines of empirical versus speculative, but rather entail the strange involvement, as we saw earlier, of observer and observed, organism and environment. It's also true that philosophy still has a job to do. I'm simply suggesting that it can continue to do it without ontological and representational pretensions, asking the kinds of questions that arise naturally as science helps us to understand, but questions that are not in themselves natural. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for questions, and we will use the microphone so that questions are recorded.
That wasn't too long, was it? 50 minutes, more or less? Okay. We'll go back to a nice image here. Here we go.
This is kind of weird. Okay. So, Cary, just to kick things off.
Yeah.
And I should tell you that I really know nothing about biology or the life sciences, so...
Right.
Okay. But with respect to Derrida and deconstruction, which was also important in your talk,
yeah.
This is just kind of a tossing it out there. Isn't the phrase the reinvention of deconstruction kind of a contradiction in terms? And what I'm getting at is, this isn't really a criticism, but rather, when you invoked of grammatology, I thought, oh yeah, well, it's pretty much all there already, sort of pre-programmed.
Yeah.
So why would one need to reinvent deconstruction if that were even possible, since everything that you're doing, that you're calling deconstruction, is sort of already implicit there in that text, no?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's just a fundamental question.
No, I think that's right. I mean, one way to think about the necessity of doing it, I think, is along the lines of the relationship between the genetic and epigenetic. So I think we're in a position now with deconstruction. I mean, I think you're quite right that you can go back to grammatology. In a way, it's all already there, which is half the story. But I think the other half of the story is that the context, the environment in which deconstruction operates and circulates and ramifies changes over time. And one of the I gestured to this earlier, one of the interesting things about this, and I think it had a lot to do with Derrida's work in deconstruction kind of becoming progressively more uncool in a way when it comes to thinking questions of life, biopolitics, et cetera, but also ecological thought even. As other forms of philosophy, most conspicuously probably Deleuze's work, kind of took off in this regard, or Deleuze's influence and inflected work took off. One of the ironies, I think, is that at a certain moment of reception, deconstruction was aligned more or less with the level of the genetic aspect of the argument only. So it's all about code, it's all about writing, it's all about script, it's all about running the program. Well, that's half the story, that's the genetic side, but the other half of the story is the epigenetic side, in which at that moment the scientific environment and the dissemination of changes in the scientific environment, in a way, and this is going to sound like arrogant in a way, but in a way kind of hadn't caught up with some of what I think Derrida was already theorizing in the late 60s, and that was because of 40 years, or maybe more at this point, of this absolute hegemony of the Neo-Darwinian reductionist paradigm, right? Which created a context in which it was easy to assume a kind of an isomorphism between what was going on there in the scientific domain and what Derrida was theorizing in grammatology. But what's happened now, and it hasn't really happened, I think, because of changes in philosophy. It's happened because of changes in the scientific environment. And those changes have happened, I think, because of work on the microbiome and work in immunology, and especially work in epigenetics. Is that now, and Kaufman's book that I was using in the talk, I think, is an index of this. I think the Neo-Darwinian reductionist paradigm is I think we're seeing a paradigm shift, and we're not seeing it because of academic scientists arguing with each other. Experimental biologists over here, molecular biologists over here, theoretical biologists over here who never talk to each other anyway. That's not what's moving the needle. What's moving the needle, I think, is massive amounts of clinical stuff having to do with epigenetics and immunology and like autoimmune disorders, massive millions and millions of people for whom the account given by the reductionist paradigm simply cannot address the complexities of the organism-environment relationship that they themselves are living through. So that's changed the environment in which the uptake of deconstruction can be, in a way sort of reinvented, I think, or ramified, differently. So that's why I made that claim in the paper that, or kind of as an aside, when I was talking about, that I think Derrida finally gives us a theory of the relationship between the genetic and the epigenetic domains. That's not something I think he ever, I actually know this for a fact from talking to him. That's not something he was ever going to do because he wasn't really reading that. He wasn't reading that material. He was reading, Paul Ricoeur or whatever, right? But he wasn't reading theoretical biology. And so I think for all these thinkers of this generation, including Deleuze and others, it falls to subsequent generations of thinkers to try to do this work of recontextualization and to say, okay, well, how far can this take us, right? I think in this case, and I didn't go into this in the talk because it was already too long, but I think it opens up a space in which the interdisciplinary conversation between kind of the two cultures can happen in a way that hasn't been possible between deconstruction and science for a long time. And it's not because I don't think it's because the letter of deconstruction really changed. I think it enables us to kind of ramify what Derrida was already talking about in the late 60s, but actually even earlier. If you think about Waddington's book was 1957, and the theoretical biological work that Derrida is quoting from in Grammatology by Amino and Jacob and others, was really hard on the heels of Waddington's work. So there's a moment there. And then the question is, what happens after that moment? And what happens after that moment is the rise of the Neo-Darwinian reductionist paradigm, which completely then forecloses a kind of space of reception, I think, for what Derrida is doing. So that's that's to unpack a little bit what I meant by this term of reinvention. But I think you're quite right. For me, like hardcore Derridians get into big arguments about early versus late Derrida and all that, and I actually don't. I think there's a very clear through line from the work from the late 60s straight through the late work. It's just that Derrida himself is taking that work and voicing it, if you will, in other directions, in other domains, having other kinds of conversations, right? And that's what I've been trying to do by kind of cross-mapping deconstruction and systems theory for, as long as I've been doing it. And that's not work that he would have done, so. Yeah. And I should say, by the way, I don't know anything about biology either. This is a non-specialist. It's me trying to kind of wrap my head around as much as I can, but I hit a wall of expertise very quickly, too, with the biological material as well, so yeah.
Vital materialism, say the vital materialism of Jane Bennett, posits a kind of flat ontology. Albeit a kind of smart ontology as well. The alternative theoretical line that you seem to have set out today seems to posit a kind of absence of ontology, or an infinitely heterocosmic ontology of series of worlds. And I'm wondering what difference that difference in way of conceiving being makes to the more specific or practical issue of, say, theorizing cross-species relationships.
Right. No, that's a great question, and it's a question I take up. It's a question I take up pretty pointedly in Before the Law at a moment in that book where, I understand the impulse of, and agree with the kind of the most basic impulse of doing a kind of flat ontology, but I think, the question you're asking in a way at the end of the day is a question of ethics, and I think it's when you go into the ethical domain that you see the serious limitations of undertaking a kind of flat ontology. The way I put it in Before the Law is I say, look, okay, it may be that the chimpanzee in a research facility is an object, and the flea on the chimpanzee's skin is an object, and the cage in which both of them sit is an object. But there are differences between these three objects, And those differences matter a hell of a lot to the chimpanzee than they do to the flea or to the cage, right? In ways that, don't evacuate the fact, what I think of as, and this was, I think, part of Sloterdijk's point too, they don't evacuate the fact that I feel like I share with people interested in flat ontology a kind of radically pluralistic, gesture that wants to be philosophical and ethical. But for me, when you really start having the serious ethical, conversations, what happens is that the ontological landscape, instead of looking like this, looks like this. Because all the different kinds of life forms that you're talking, and not just life forms, we could talk about ecological systems that are not, or they're only partially carbon-based life forms, that all of them share the kind of formal characteristics that I was gesturing toward here, but that create very, very different kinds of specific ways of being in the world that I think one has to, tend to. So I find a lot of times, I published in my series Ian Bogo's book, Alien Phenomenology, and I do find the flat ontology gesture can be, a bit facile, actually, in the face of these kinds of questions. And so I sort of go in the direction, as Derrida puts it in The Animal That Therefore I Am. It's not about effacing and erasing, the differences between different ways of being in the world. It's actually about multiplying and amplifying and thickening and so on these kinds of questions. And I don't know what that landscape ends up looking like, actually, but it doesn't look like this.
No, no, but a wiggly line is still a line.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, and I don't think there's any escaping lines. I mean, the whole point about, let's put it this way: you can't worry about the issue of having lines unless you have already maintained your self-referential closure and autopoiesis in a world of overwhelming complexity so that you can have the problem.
Is that the function of the trace?
That is the function of the trace, exactly. And so the trace, one way to kind of stitch your question, the two ends of your question together, the trace would be the deconstructive way of thinking the flat ontology that subtends the formal dynamics that then give rise to these different kinds of recursivity and closure, and then it's off to the races we go with swim bladders and not giraffes, but worms and so on, right?
So the trace is the pineal gland then?
I mean, a pineal gland, I guess you would say, yeah. But it would be, that's what when I quoted Martin Hagelin's work at the end about the negativity of time. One thing I'm trying to zero in on here, and I brought this up briefly when I quoted Sloterdijk's work from Foams. One thing that I'm attracted to in deconstruction, and I would highly recommend the opening chapter of David Willis's book, In Animation, which zeroes in on this, is its insistence on what Derrida calls the kind of machinalité and indeed kind of radical ahuman technicity and a not organic technicity. So the trace, when I said in that quotation, what's really important to hear is that the trace actually traverses not just the biological and technical, but the life-death relation, as he puts it. That, to me, to come back to the flat ontology question, that, to me, is the most fundamental sort of formal bedrock that Derrida insists on that I think you don't get in a lot of adjacent and competing versions of this, including Sloterdijk, right? It's the machinalité, the technicity, the radically ahuman quality of these processes that give rise to and can but don't have to eventuate in certain forms of life. That's what deconstruction insists on, that I find a crucial part of theorizing this whole problem, right? That you don't get, I think, in some of these, or I don't get actually from some of these other ideas.
First of all, I just wanted to say I really appreciate the talk. I'm glad I don't know your name, I apologize, but Matthew, okay. I'm glad you brought up Jane Bennett's book, because one of the things that she does that a lot of other people critical of Derrida have done is basically say, I really admire what Derrida is doing. I really appreciate deconstruction, but it's not really practically useful. Basically for the reasons that you've outlined, which is like instead of giving you a straight line, we're going to give you just infinite complexity. And they say, okay, so I'm gonna bracket off Derrida and basically say, like, I don't really want to engage with him. I want to try and come to some concrete, pragmatic answer.
Yeah.
And obviously, what you've done today is just say, okay, let's take something that's trying to be simple and just complicate it again. At least, kind of in some kind of practical way. I guess my question for you, and it's a little bit zoomed out, it's a little bit meta, is how do we engage these disciplines that are trying to be reductive? And it's not only biology, as somebody like Bennett shows, it's also in the ethical. How do we engage with these people, or these groups of thinkers, and say, okay, there's value in complication, there's value in the difficulty of thinking through these things. How do we engage in that kind of normative debate and shift what we're trying to accomplish? Because I think if we don't do that, then a lot of people in biology aren't really going to care about what we have to say, right? They're just going to say, well, that's what we're trying to do.
I actually think this is going to be a different kind of answer, I think, than you expected, but I actually think the main challenge in some ways is more institutional than intellectual. I mean, within academia. I think part of the problem is that the institutional imbalance has become, at least in the States, but I would guess in Canada it's pretty similar, has become so severe that most people working in the sciences, at least the ones I've interacted with, are working under constraints that I think you would find almost shocking in terms of what actually counts as tenurable knowledge in their disciplines. And so, which has to do with, okay, I got to come up with experimental protocols that give me, robustly repeatable statistical results. What are those results indexed to typically? They're indexed to adaptive fitness. What does adaptive fitness mean? It means the passing along of genetic material. This is what counts as real knowledge, and everything else is pretty tightly policed from what I've been able to see in my interactions with scientists. And so the institutional site on which, if you say to some of these scientists, as I have, look, you do realize that trying to say that the way that we interpret a novel is indexable to, the kind of framework that I just described, they'll say, they're smart people, they'll say, oh yeah, of course I know that. But that's not what I do as a scientist. Right? So I think the problem is that scientists look at us and everything I just said today, and they would just say, all you're going to do is make my life more complicated. I already have all of the institutional prestige and resources. I already have that. You're not going to bring that to me. All you're going to do is open this Pandora's box that I'm going to have to spend my time closing, and I don't want to spend my time closing it because institutionally it's already closed, right? Now, one place I think this can go, and I think maybe is starting to go, is to renew the conversations between experimental biologists and theoretical biologists who have not talked to each other much at all for the last, 40 years or something. And I hope that the pressure, as I said a moment ago, that the pressure for that conversation is going to come from more and more and more stuff going on out in the world, especially around issues of like autoimmune disorders, of which there are now massive multi-million people, user groups and so on in communities, with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue and lots of other stuff. That are kind of pushing the conversation beyond the narrow institutional confines in terms of how people are trained. So I actually think that's the bigger challenge than the intellectual challenge. The only other thing I'll say in this regard, in terms of really getting real and practical about this, is I have been on committees with scientists one committee was on the alternatives to the use of animals in biomedical research that I was a member of with people from the scientific community. And a lot of what makes it work is actually the individual people who are involved. It's about trust building, especially with the scientists. And this is why I think a lot of institutionally top-down interdisciplinary initiatives often don't work. You know, when you're trying to go across the science and humanities domains, so I jokingly said one time, a scientist asked me, he's like, if you're going to start one of these initiatives, what you do? I said, well, I would start a drinking club, actually, first. This is kind of create the conditions out of which something can self-organize and emerge. I'd be like, okay, all the martini people meet on Wednesdays, and all the whiskey people meet on Fridays. And this is what happens, actually. You do that, and after about the second or third session, you get to the person next to you who's working on the other side of campus, and you sort of say, after a couple drinks, you say, well, hey, what do you do anyway? And they tell you, and you start talking. That's actually how it happens, is you have to kind of create the conditions in which a genuine kind of, interdisciplinary interest can emerge, I think. And so that's another huge challenge. So there's two answers probably you didn't expect to your question, but yeah.
I want to try that in my next grant application. Build the drinking club into it.
Hey, you can't even get reimbursed for alcohol, so you're not going to, it's just an uphill battle, I think, No, I think that's a great. I mean, I got into all this. Actually, I was an animal rights activist in the 80s, and that's how I got into all this animal studies, post-human. And there was no academic. There really wasn't any academic discourse around it back then. Official academic discourse. So these kinds of pragmatic questions are ones that, for me, have always been a driver, for what I'm doing. And I've seen the change in the students. The difference between students now and when I first started talking about this stuff 25 years ago is huge and hugely mainstreamed in a way that, the academic work partly made happen, but not really. It was just broader cultural change,
I've got a very sort of basic question.
Yeah.
And there's apparently a debate, which is more or less, as far as I can tell, very strongly started by Graham Harman, where Graham Harman says that he is deeply invested in not being a materialist, and he says that object-oriented ontology should not be materialism. He has issues with Quentin Meillassoux, calling speculative realism speculative materialism.
Right.
Anyway, all that stuff, right?
Right.
That kind of debate between materialism
Right.
and realism.
Right.
And you cited that interesting sounding article from Angelaki where someone, I forget who the name was.
Ronnie Paudouis, teaches at Villanova, yeah.
Oh, neat. Okay.
Yeah.
And that individual said you can be a materialist and an anti-realist at the same time. But anyway, my question for you is just, do you have any dog in this pony race, or whatever the saying is, do you have any kind of an investment in the debate between materialism and realism? Do you see your work as fitting more into one or the other, or do you see yourself as some kind of more of a dialectical thinker? Just a basic question.
None of the above.
Okay.
I'm definitely not a dialectical thinker, for reasons that you could trace back to the influence of Derrida and Foucault in a different way on my work, but mainly just for the kind of second order turn in systems theory reasons that are hardwired into the kind of stuff that I do, which prevents you right out of the gate from being. It doesn't prevent you from being a circular and recursive thinker, but it does prevent you from being a dialectical thinker. So no to that. I'm not materialism and realism. I am so tired of talking about these terms. It's hard to, there's just so much noise, I think, that goes with these terms in philosophy and theory that I try to not use them. So, and this is why, speaking of doing stuff that's really uncool, this is why I actually go back to Rorty. and objectivity, relativism, truth, because the issue for me is actually philosophical representationalism is the problem. And, once you start having conversations about materialism and realism, you've kind of already ended up in the cul-de-sac of a tacit investment in philosophical representationalism, and I have no investment in philosophical representationalism. In fact, I think it's a completely misguided undertaking. And that's partly because, at the end of the day, philosophically, I'm a pragmatist thinker, to come back to your, So I have a completely different orientation to these questions, as Rorty says in Objectivity, Relativism, and Truth, the pragmatist does not have a theory of truth, much less a relativistic one, right? So, and so that's why I read Deleuze, and I read Lyotard, and I read Foucault, and I read Derrida as pragmatist philosophers. Now, in each of those people, there's a tension between that pragmatism and another impulse or desire in their work. In Derrida, it's metaphysics, in Deleuze, it's ontology, in Foucault's historicism. But I think that tension is fruitful and generative, right? But I read them all as pragmatist thinkers, So for me, it's a different. I just come at these questions really differently from most people. But what I will say with regard to Triple O and SR, object-oriented ontology and speculative realism, is, Tim Morton's one of my best friends. We're colleagues at Rice, and I've said to Tim many times, look, I just think it's just increasingly impossible to generalize about object-oriented ontology and speculative realism. I find the work that's associated with those labels to be just actually increasingly divergent and heterogeneous, and different in style, right? Graham's the kind of thinker who will often make a lot of, I think, very traditional, classically philosophical kind of gestures. And meanwhile, Tim's over here on basically an acid trip, which I think is good. So I said to Tim, I said, look, you're an aesthete. You cut your teeth on Shelley, in Romantic poetry. That's where he got his bona fides as a scholar. So I said, so he has an aesthetic sensibility that somebody like Graham totally does not have, and some of the other thinkers, associated with this don't have. So I told him, I said, the crazier your work is, the better, actually, I think, because for me, it's not about getting at the nature of reality. It's speculative thought, that can open up questions in ways that we hadn't thought about before and hadn't approached in a certain way before. So I think, I'm just talking about two of the foremost prominent figures in object-oriented ontologies. So even within that domain, that limited group, I think the work is really, really, I just think it's hard to generalize about. And when they start, having the kind of arguments they have about these terms that you're asking about, I just like, I don't care. You guys just knock yourselves out. Just say something interesting, but, knock yourselves out. I don't, yeah.
Sorry, just to play devil's advocate. Doesn't the notion of trace require at least a minimum of philosophical representationalism?
No.
Okay. That's Hillary Putnam's answer too, isn't it? When he talks about how you could basically eliminate any talk about semantics when you're thinking about thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it would be a Rortian answer too. To talk about the trace is not to talk about relations of representation, it's to talk about relations of causation. It's a techne that makes things happen but does not determine things, right? But it's not there's no, part of Hagelin's point about the negativity of time, which I think is important, is precisely that there's no, there's no spot at which the trace, as it were, exists because of its constitutive temporality, because of the negativity of temporality. So for me, it's not For me, it's not a representational term. Actually, what I thought you were going to say was that, well, to talk about the trace, you have to be a materialist in some sense. And that's the question. And that's the question that I do understand, and I think in a way is right. And if I had to have a dog in the fight to come down on, with your question, it would be for me. Realism is a term I would never use. Materialism, I'm much more amenable to but then of course, then you're immediately in the domain of, well, what about new materialism? And then you get into, that whole conversation. So anyway, yeah. Anyway, that's what I thought you were going to ask.
Okay, and perhaps my question leads obliquely back to that anyways. But your example of the heart was really quite interesting insofar as it's the function of the heart to pump, but the activity of the heart has many more causal consequences. So it works as a function, or one can distinguish between its function and its causality.
Its function for the autopoietic whole, yes.
And doesn't trace function within system. And then the trace is itself a trace only by its difference from non-traces, which are causes. So trace then becomes a different kind of cause, or not a cause, and a retroactive positive that has to be somehow recognized.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. The trace, the easiest way to think about this, and I actually find that this is the easiest way to describe this to students, actually, is the trace. The trace is a site of retention and protension, right? It's the materialization of really a vanishing point relation of retention and protension, right? And if you put that in evolutionary terms, as I was trying to do with Kaufman, I think it's easier for students to sort of wrap their head around the fact that this is a site of inscription and retention and protension that, in a sense, isn't simply located in that materialization, right? But it's also not just a determined output of some code, right, that somehow entails or predetermines that materialization either, right? It's an ongoing dynamic relationship between genetic and epigenetic, for which the negativity of time is constitutive, right, irreducibly, right? So maybe materialization is better than materiality in a way, as a way to think about this. But I do think I don't know what you found, but I have found with students that taking this stuff and kind of transposing it into discussions about evolution in the biological domain, then they're like, oh yeah, okay. They get it in a way that they don't get it if you stay within the phenomenological and post-phenomenological, philosophical language, which is not one by and large, they know, right? So.
Question, but a very quick one, because yesterday I have some of my students here from the posthumanism class, and we were talking about
the people who look like they're forced to be here.
No, they're just happy to be here.
They're happy to be here.
Look at their shocked faces.
Yeah.
But we were discussing yesterday the tension that you referred to earlier between ontology and ethics, and how you can be conceiving of certain things, and you were championing speculation and saying, well, I don't really care if we're describing what's out there, but think something interesting and be creative, and then we can take that speculation further. But then there's the ethical concern, and we were sort of talking about that in relation to Rosie Bredotti's work, The Posthuman, last night. So I'm sure, I see Jane nodding here, and so I think maybe if you could say a little more about that tension, because where does that take us if we engage in creative, fun, wild, speculative thinking, but we still have to be pragmatists and resolve or try to resolve very concrete ethical problems?
Well, I don't think creativity or being speculative and ethical responsibility are opposites. I think those are two things that get the relationship between those two gets conjugated anew, you might say, in specific situations, right? I think it depends on what you're trying to do, right? What you think your ethical dilemma or charge is at a particular moment, right? So, the way that I think about this, and I talked about it before the law, and I do think, and I've always thought actually that Derrida is right about this, that what ethics is, I agree with him, and this is like the opposite of the kind of the, maybe more kind of liberal justice, tradition and analytic side, certainly the side that you get in animal rights philosophy of, Singer or Reagan. I think what ethics is not propositionally deriving what the right or good thing is to do and then having that in your back pocket and applying it to situations you walk into. I think Derrida is right that you have to go through this kind of what he calls the ordeal of the undecidable in confronting the relationship between that stuff in your back pocket and what he calls the pragmatic instance that you confront, which is an instance of iteration, to use his example, that's always going to call that into question, right? And is literally, and that context is strictly speaking inexhaustibly bottomless and complex, right? And that's where thinking creatively, thinking speculatively, thinking outside the box can actually be really helpful, I think, in the ethical domain. So the example that I use in Before the Law, it's like, look, do I think killing marine mammals is wrong? You bet I do. And I can give you a long list of scientific reasons about what we know about dolphins, about other, similar creatures, that I think would make a very good case for why doing violence to them is wrong. But does that give me the right to walk into, an Inuit community and say, you know what, you guys, back over here in this thing called the university, which is populated, oh, by the way, mainly by white middle-class people, but let's leave that aside for the moment. We have figured out that this is a bad thing to do, so the way that you guys have been living for 2,000 years, you need to stop. And when you put it that way, you just sound like an asshole. And you are being an asshole because you're not attending to the kind of iterative collision between the things that you know over here and the modes of thinking that you have engaged in over here, let's call it propositional philosophy in the service of ethics, and the relationship between that and the anthropological, cultural, historical situation that you find yourself in, right? And in those situations, I think, not just speculative thought, but actually art can be really, really useful in kind of loosening up what you have in your back pocket and enabling you to think in ways that you didn't know you could think, right, about these kinds of questions. And I don't think there's no, and I'm glad that there is no formula. And I think Derrida is glad that there is no formula for how that conjugation is going to work in each instance. But I think about this constantly. I ran into this, to go back to your question, I ran into this when I was an animal rights activist. I used to go to rodeo protests with Tom Reagan before I even knew that he was a philosopher. Like, oh, this is the guy who wrote the case for animal rights. Holy shit, right? But we were just part of the same animal rights group. Later, I read his work and I read Peter Singer's work. And even though I was in the thick of a deep, unstructured, theoretically ethical commitment around this question of the treatment of non-human animals, I knew that there was something wrong with the way that was theorized in animal rights philosophy. And going to other kinds of speculative thought, in my case deconstruction, but not just deconstruction, other stuff too, enabled me to gradually think this ethical problem and my responsibilities in this domain in a different way. in a way that was quite different from the kind of philosophy that Singer and Reagan were doing. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, on this note, I want to thank you very much for this presentation, very stimulating ideas and whatnot, and I would like to ask you to join me in thanking Cary.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.